Good afternoon. I'm going to get that right every week. So, we started looking at the Sermon on the Mount at our services, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., 5 weeks ago. And I was thinking about how nice it started. Like the first word is blessed. And then it's lots of sentences of blessed are those, blessed are those, blessed are those. But this week, we start with beware, which doesn't feel as nice. And it's one or two times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to start a section by saying, beware. And so we're shifting now to a warning of such. But before we jump into that, let's remember the structure of the Sermon on the Mount. We started with vision and values as Jesus explained the characteristics of the kingdom of God with his Beatitudes. Then we move on to a call where he calls his followers of Jesus to be salt and light. It's interesting because there's all these structures of the Sermon on the Mount and these sections. And then the third section was challenges to the status quo, challenges to how we think about the requirements of the law. So he addressed murder, he addressed adultery, he addressed oaths, he addressed loving your enemy, but he pushed it past the bare minimum to challenge the condition of our heart and how healthy we really are. But today, we shift to a new section, a 3-week warning of such that starts with beware. Now, this is not the only time Jesus will start or use the word beware. He tells us later in the Sermon on the Mount, in the second last week, before we get to the lovely ending of the wise and foolish builder, where if you build your life on these teachings, it's going to be like a wise builder. Before that, we get to beware of false prophets. Later in Matthew, he tells us to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. He tells us to beware of deception. He tells us to beware of greed. And then the one I'm teaching my daughter when she's dating age is beware of men. It's actually like be on guard because if I send you out, people will try to round you up. But I still think both are good teachings. So we've got a warning today, though. But this is a warning about the danger we could be creating for ourselves. We are now shifting from Jesus addressing the condition of our hearts to addressing our motives behind our actions. So I'm going to start with the first verse of chapter 6. It says, beware not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So this section right now is addressing what Jesus calls the 3 acts of righteousness, which we know as practices for following Jesus. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to address today giving, next week at 10 a.m. prayer, and next week at 4 p.m. fasting. And he calls these the acts of righteousness. And he says there is a danger to having the wrong motive behind these acts. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit. But before we do, it's interesting is because I was preparing this week, I've talked to a few people in my life, some Christians, some non-Christians this week, just to ask the question of whether an action's morality is determined by the intention or the outcome. And it's been an interesting conversation with lots of different people this week, whether an action's morality is determined by its intentions or its actions. And quite often the conversation has led to people trying to tell me that the ends justify the means. That if there is ultimately a good outcome, isn't that good? Which I find a real interesting argument. So I try to wrestle with it through the mindset of, say, we live in a world of influencers now. And quite often influencers are doing great things online. But the intention might not be wholesome. It might not be the right motive. It might be to get clicks. It might be to get good PR. It might be a lot of things. So wrestling with the morality of the motive behind a decision. But the response I've been getting from people is if someone gets helped, who cares? It's good because someone got helped. Ultimately, I keep getting told that the ends justify the means. So I think the interesting thing then is to ask what we believe to be morality. Now, if you Google what is morality, it'll just tell you it's principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. Okay, but what principles? And whose principles? So that then shifts depending on what country we live in, what friendship group we're in, what we belong to, what we participate in. Those principles and behaviors are constantly shifting based on the sphere we enter. But if we're followers of Jesus, we should be concerned with morality according to the Bible. And a morality according to the Bible is based on the character and the nature of God. It doesn't have any wiggle room. It views right and wrong with absolute divine standards rather than subjective human decisions and choices. And what we're seeing in today's passage is Jesus isn't looking past our intention and our motive. He is saying our intention and our motive matters, and our motive should be challenged. And according to the teachings of Jesus, if we look at this passage, the ends don't justify the means. The means, which is our methods, and our outcomes, which is the ends, both must be righteous. So sinning to achieve good results is condemned according to Jesus, which is really interesting because it means that God cares about the integrity of the process, not just the result and the outcome. So we can read on a little bit. In verse 2 it says, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." So summarize this bit. It says, don't give like the hypocrites do. So how do we understand that word hypocrite? Because how we understand that word hypocrite would be largely someone who says one thing and does something else. But that's not the accurate translation of the Greek word that's being used in this text. Because the accurate translation of the Greek word would be to read it more as stage actor. So what Jesus is actually saying is sorry, I lost my place for a minute. I can't read. So what Jesus is actually saying is when you give to the needy, don't put on a show. Don't perform. Don't act. Don't do it with the intention of making sure others see it. Don't do it for the applause of men. Because what is really worrying is Jesus says, if your outcome, if your motive, if your intention is to do it so others can see, if your intention is to do it so you can have the applause of men, then that's what you'll get. But you'll miss out on the true reward. So the applause is what you'll get, but you'll miss out on the true reward, which means applause is not the reward. So if it's not the reward, it can't be the intention and the motive. Which I think is really interesting. You know, like, I remember growing up in a time before influencers and social media. And I remember, like, as a young person, noticing that, like, actors, musicians, politicians would deliberately make sure they were seen doing their charity work. It was really important that if they were doing charity work, they would be seen, that it would be caught on camera, that it would be made note of, because ultimately it was good for their PR, it was good for their reputation. And so the intention and the motives behind that is quite questionable, because do they actually want to do good things, or do they want to improve how people see them or what they see of them? And so as a young kid, I remember always seeing through that and questioning that and wrestling with that. But now we live in a day and age when everything is online. We have a whole generation that can't separate good works from content. And that's challenging. And I don't want to sound like the old grumpy man in the room complaining about this generation and their social medias, because the ultimate thing is they've got better technology and platforms, but they learnt from the previous generations. So it's not on them. John 12:43 says, "For they love human praise more than praise from God." I think that's the haunting challenge in what Jesus is saying in this passage, is what is our desired outcome? Because it is good to help people. It is good to give to the needy. It is good to pray. It is good to fast. But we're not meant to do that with the hope and the desire and in the intention that others will see it and applaud those efforts. We're not meant to do it in a way that's putting on a show. So let's talk a little bit more about motive, because motive is powerful. But how do we determine our motive? See, I think there's a power to asking why. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But it's something I understood a lot more when I was pastoring a church in Liverpool because it was mostly a young congregation. We're talking like well under 30, but above 18. And so for them, they're reading the Bible, they're growing in it, but then they're wrestling with the reality for the rest of their peers who don't know Jesus, who don't read the Bible, who haven't tried to commit to a life like that. And so the struggle is if you tell that generation, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, this is what you shouldn't do, it's not as powerful as teaching them to ask, why do I want to do this? So like drinking was a massive problem for the young people in our church because we were a city center church and people drunk. And they drunk a lot and they liked to overdo it. And that was a big problem for that generation. And so we'd have young people all the time talking with us about that issue. And so instead of telling them you shouldn't get drunk, or the Bible says all things are good in moderation, or don't get drunk, instead of trying to say don't, we taught them to ask why. Why do you want to make this choice? Why do you want to pursue this action? Then what does the answer to that question tell you about where you're at right now and your current state? There were some really powerful conversations where you sat with them and said, why do you want to get drunk? You are enabling them to answer honestly that they're struggling because they want to participate in that with their friends. But instead of condemning them, you're saying, why? Is it fear of missing out? Is it worried about being separated and not included by your friends? Sometimes actually it wasn't any of that. Sometimes it was because I'm hurting. And when I get drunk, it stops hurting. So then it's like, well, why are you hurting? You see, there's power to why. And that's what Jesus is trying to encourage us to do right now. He's not saying if you give, if you pray, if you fast, because he knows that's what we need to do as followers of Jesus. He's just asking us to make sure our motive is correct when we do those things, to ask why. If we follow don'ts, we're talking about religious behavior modification that almost always leads to failure. But if we ask why, that might lead to revelation and give us the opportunity for transformation. You see, the power of asking why is about our capacity to move beyond superficial explanations and get to the root cause of what's really going on inside of us. It's crucial for self-awareness, personal and spiritual growth. Jesus was really good at why questions. So many times you'd see him in front of someone and he'd ask a really strong why question. One time, someone was talking to him and he said, why are you looking for me? Another time he said, do you love me? Another time he said, why do you call me good? He asked really tough, confronting questions that caused people to ask why behind the motive of their action that they're in the moment. So the takeaway from this scripture in a nutshell is that the underlying reason or driving force behind your action, your choice, or your behavior matters to God. It matters to God. He's not wanting you to perform for him, just like he's not wanting you to perform for others. See, that should be somewhat liberating. We come to church because we love God, not because we have to, not because we feel a need to perform. We worship out of an expression of love, not because God says we have to worship, not because we feel like we need to perform. This is really important because he wants us to pray, he wants us to give, he wants us to fast, but he wants us to be open and honest about our intention and our motive behind it, so that our driving force is this love of God that's fundamental to the commandment, love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and love others as you love yourself. So when we do these actions from that place of love, from that motive, then it starts to transform us. It starts to bring us closer to God. It increases our intimacy. And I think that's probably starting to get closer to what he's talking about when he says true reward. And that's something that's much greater than the applause of man. So what does Jesus suggest we do about this? Well, he says in verse 3, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. I mean, that's obviously hyperbole because the left hand and the right hand are controlled by the same brain. So I think it's a lot of mental gymnastics to try to do something with your left hand, and that's my right hand, and not let your left hand, and that's my left hand, know what the right hand. The ultimate thing is that we would be transformed so much through analyzing our why and our intention that we would do things instinctually. So there's no time to stop and think what we're doing. There's no time to stop and think, is someone noticing? Am I performing? Am I acting? That it would be so instinctual that there would be sincerity to it, so nothing else seeps in. See, when we do these things with the right motives and sincerity, giving creates generosity. Prayer fuels humility and intimacy, and fasting empowers sacrifice and reliance. And some of those things are powerful fruit of the Spirit, powerful fruit of transformation. And all this works towards that call that I mentioned earlier on, that call for us to be salt and light. Salt purifies and preserves, whereas light reveals Jesus and exposes darkness. So when it comes to giving and the further acts of righteousness, prayer and fasting, we need to allow our motive to be pure so that the outcome is something that glorifies Jesus, not us. The outcome needs to glorify Jesus, not us. You see, the interesting thing is the topic was give to the needy, but it doesn't actually talk at all about giving to the needy. It doesn't talk about what you should give, how much you should give, how often you should give. It just says that you're meant to give. And then it points to you internally, to your motive, to your intention. And he's already addressed the condition of your heart. So a simple question to ask as I come to a close, and I ask the band to come back up. They look like they've just gotten really comfortable, but we can ask a simple question or a few questions. And it's okay to ask these questions. We had an amazing sermon this morning on love your enemies. And so you can catch up on that online. But at the end, it challenged anyone who felt that they were challenged by that sermon that you should stand. I stood. I'm constantly challenged by having to love people. Life is difficult. People constantly come at you, and you have to challenge to let go of that. You have to challenge yourself to love people. It's so easy to separate yourself from people who are difficult. It's much harder to love. And so I stood up because I'm not particularly this week feeling like that's a problem, but I can't tell you that's never, ever going to be a problem because of the world we live in, the reality we walk in. And so when I say we should ask these questions, it's okay to say, I feel like I might need to perform. That in areas of my life, I'm performing. I've found myself feeling like I need to perform for God. I found myself feeling like I need to perform when I come to church. So the first question to ask is, do you feel like you are performing? Is there an area in your life where you feel like you're performing? Is there an area in your life where you feel like you're putting on a show or you're putting on an act? Have you found yourself doing things in the hope that others will notice? And if the answer to some of them is yes, as we stand in worship, just start to ask why. Just start to ask why. And as we're worshiping, God will start to minister to you. And as you ask why, that's where the revelation starts to bubble up. Maybe there's something going on inside that you haven't seen, that's been a bit sheltered. And this is the time, this is the moment, this is the question where God's going to address that. And that's what's so good about God, is he's never done with us. He's always intimately walking with us and addressing these things and lifting us up to a different standard, transforming us, growing us, caring for us. Because God cares about the integrity of the process, not just the results or the outcome. So how about we stand, I'll pray, and then we'll just go back into a space of worship.